At 14:23 on the afternoon of October 8, 1918, rain had turned the Argonne Forest floor into black mud that swallowed boots to the ankle. Private Harold Pierce, 22 years old, sat behind a Hotchkiss M 1914 machine gun that had been rejected by the French Army for excessive barrel wear. The weapon had been issued to his unit because ammunition shortages made the newer Brownings too valuable to waste on holding actions. Pierce's position was a shell crater 18 meters west of a destroyed supply road. The crater was 1.4 meters deep. 3 hours earlier, his lieutenant had told him the gun probably wouldn't fire more than 40 rounds before jamming. At 14:22, a German runner had approached under a white cloth tied to a bayonet. The message was simple: abandon the position in 75 seconds or be eliminated by direct assault. Pierce watched the runner disappear into the tree line 130 meters northeast. He did not move. Harold Pierce had worked in a textile mill in Lawrence, Massachusetts before the war. He operated a jacquard loom, a machine that required constant monitoring for thread tension and pattern errors. His foreman had written in a reference letter that Pierce could detect a broken thread by sound alone while operating 6 looms simultaneously. He was 5 feet 7 inches tall and weighed 131 pounds at enlistment. His rifle qualification scores were average. His physical endurance scores were below average. During training at Camp Devens, an instructor had removed him from a Lewis gun crew because his arms shook after 20 minutes of sustained firing. The instructor assigned him to ammunition carrying detail. Pierce had arrived in France in July of 1918, attached to the 77th Division as a replacement. The division called itself the Statue of Liberty Division, but other units called them the Metropolitan Men because most had never fired a weapon before conscription. The Hotchkiss M 1914 weighed 24.9 kilograms without its tripod. With the tripod, 51 kilograms. The weapon fired the 8mm Liebel cartridge at a rate of 450 rounds per minute when functioning correctly. The feed system used rigid metal strips holding 24 rounds each. The French had phased the weapon out in 1916 after repeated complaints about overheating and strip feed failures. Pierce's weapon had a visible crack in the receiver housing near the barrel assembly. The tripod was missing its elevation lock. Someone had carved the initials RM into the buttstock. The division armorer had told Pierce's company commander that the weapon should be used for parts, not combat. On October 7th, the 77th Division had attempted to advance through the Argonne Forest toward the Decauville railway line. German forces held elevated positions along a ridge line that ran northwest to southeast. The ridge provided clear observation of all approaches. In 6 hours, the division had advanced 80 meters and suffered 214 casualties. Casualty clearing stations ran out of stretchers by noon. By evening, Division Command had ordered all units to hold current positions and establish defensive perimeters. The order stated that no reinforcements were available. It stated that ammunition resupply would be limited to critical positions only. It did not state how long the division would remain in place. Company K of the 308th Infantry had been ordered to hold a section of damaged road that connected to a destroyed bridge crossing. The road was no longer usable, but German forces could use it as an approach route if they counterattacked during darkness. Company K had lost its commander and both lieutenants during the advance. A sergeant named William Kovach assumed command of 41 remaining men. Kovach had been a Pittsburgh police officer before the war. He organized the men into 3 groups. One group would establish a forward listening post. One group would maintain the main defensive line 60 meters behind the listening post. One group would prepare a fallback position, another 80 meters back. Pierce was assigned to the forward listening post because Kovach needed someone to operate the Hotchkiss and no one else volunteered. The listening post consisted of Pierce, a corporal named D'Angelo, who would serve as spotter, and a private named Wills, who carried extra ammunition strips. They moved into position at 11:40. D'Angelo told Pierce that the post was expendable. He said their job was to fire enough rounds to warn the main line before retreating. He said the Hotchkiss would jam before they fired 60 rounds, and they should plan to abandon it when that happened. The shell crater Pierce occupied had been created by German artillery 3 days earlier. The crater faced northeast toward a section of forest, where tree trunks had been shattered into vertical splinters by repeated bombardment. Beyond the splintered trees, the forest remained dense. Visibility was approximately 140 meters before the intact tree line created a visual barrier. Pierce positioned the Hotchkiss on the northeastern lip of the crater. He stacked 8 ammunition strips on a piece of canvas to his right. Each strip contained 24 rounds. Total available ammunition was 192 rounds. He test-fired the weapon at 12:05. 3-round burst. The weapon fired. The barrel became hot enough to create visible vapor from rainwater on the receiver. D'Angelo and Wills positioned themselves 3 meters behind Pierce on the opposite side of the crater. Standard doctrine required the spotter to be adjacent to the gunner. D'Angelo ignored this. He told Pierce that when the gun jammed, they would run southwest toward the main line, and Pierce should not wait for help clearing the jam. At 13:10, German rifle fire came from the northeast tree line. The fire was not directed at Pierce's position. It was directed at something in the forest to the east. The firing lasted 11 minutes. At 13:47, American voices shouted from the east. The voices were requesting medical assistance. No one came. At 14:18, movement appeared in the splintered tree section. D'Angelo identified 4 figures moving south. The figures wore German field gray uniforms. They moved carefully, using cover. They were not advancing. They were observing. D'Angelo did not order Pierce to fire. At 14:21, one figure broke from the tree line carrying a white cloth tied to a rifle. The figure walked directly toward the crater without deviation. He stopped at 40 meters and called out in accented English. The message was delivered in 3 sentences. First sentence, "You are cut off and your main force has retreated." Second sentence, "Abandon your position within 75 seconds and you will not be harmed." Third sentence, "If you remain, you will be killed." The runner did not wait for a response. He turned and walked back to the tree line. D'Angelo looked at Pierce. He said the Germans were lying about the main force retreating, but probably correct about being cut off. He said they had no way to verify either claim. He told Wills to move back to the main line and inform Kovac of the situation. Wills left immediately. D'Angelo asked Pierce if the gun would fire. Pierce said it had fired before. D'Angelo nodded. He said he would remain until he saw what the Germans did next. He said Pierce should do what he thought correct. Pierce did not speak. He checked the ammunition strip loaded in the Hotchkiss. The strip was fully seated. He pulled the charging handle twice to verify movement. The action cycled. He adjusted the tripod legs to lower the barrel angle by approximately 4 degrees. This change aimed the weapon at the base of the splintered trees rather than the trunks. He wiped rain from the rear sight. The sight was bent slightly to the left. He did not attempt to adjust it. He placed his right hand on the trigger and his left hand on the barrel cooling fins. The fins were warm. At 14:24, the 75 seconds expired. Movement came from 3 positions simultaneously. The splintered tree section at 130 meters, a fallen log cluster at 105 meters, a drainage depression at 90 meters. Pierce counted 9 men in the first group, 7 in the second group, 5 in the third group. They advanced in bounds. One group moved while others provided covering positions. This was standard infantry doctrine. The men in covering positions did not fire. They were waiting to identify Pierce's location before committing to suppression. Pierce tracked the nearest group. They were moving from the drainage depression toward a cratered area at 70 meters. The group leader carried an MP-18 submachine gun. The others carried Gewehr 98 rifles. They moved quickly, but without panic. At 14:25, Pierce fired. The first burst was 11 rounds. The weapon functioned. Recoil pushed the tripod backward 3 centimeters in the mud. The barrel climbed despite Pierce's attempt to control it. Rounds impacted across the advancing group at 70 meters. 2 men fell immediately. 1 man stumbled and fell forward. The others dropped into cover. Pierce released the trigger. He shifted aim to the log cluster at 105 meters. The men there were raising weapons. He fired before they fired. 6 rounds. 1 man jerked backward. The others went prone behind the logs. Pierce shifted to the splintered trees. The group there had not moved. They were in good cover and waiting. He did not fire. He looked back at the 70-meter position. One of the fallen men was crawling toward the crater area. Pierce fired a 4-round burst. The man stopped crawling. D'Angelo was shouting. Pierce could not distinguish the words. He checked the ammunition strip. 12 rounds remaining in the current strip. He scanned all three enemy positions. No movement. At 14:26, rifle fire came from the log cluster. Rounds impacted the crater lip 8 inches from the Hotchkiss tripod. Mud sprayed across the receiver. Pierce ducked below the lip. He counted 4 seconds. He rose and fired at the log cluster without aiming carefully. 7 rounds. The enemy fire stopped. He dropped below the lip again. D'Angelo was no longer shouting. Pierce looked back. D'Angelo was gone. Pierce was alone in the crater. The ammunition strip was empty. Pierce removed it and placed it in the mud beside him. He took a fresh strip and loaded it into the feed mechanism. The strip seated but required force. The feed lips were slightly bent. He charged the weapon. The action cycled, but the resistance was greater than before. At 14:27, movement came from the right flank. Pierce turned. 4 men were advancing from a position he had not previously identified. They were at 85 meters and moving at a run toward a shell hole 40 meters from his crater. He fired. The weapon jammed after 3 rounds. The spent strip had not fully ejected and was blocking the feed mechanism. Pierce pulled the strip free. It was hot enough to burn his hand, but he did not release it. He threw it aside and charged the weapon again. It cycled. The advancing men had reached the shell hole. Pierce fired at the shell hole. 15 rounds continuous. The barrel began to glow near the chamber. 1 man rose from the shell hole attempting to throw a stick grenade. Pierce continued firing. The man fell back into the hole. The grenade detonated inside the hole. Pierce stopped firing. He had 9 rounds remaining in the strip. His ears were not functioning correctly. He could hear his own breathing, but external sounds were muffled and distant. Smoke rose from the barrel cooling fins. The rain turned the smoke into a low hanging cloud around the weapon. At 14:28, he heard a whistle. The sound came from the splintered trees. German voices shouted commands. Movement began from multiple positions. Pierce counted at least 12 men advancing. They were not using bounds. They were advancing simultaneously in a skirmish line. The nearest was 60 meters away. Pierce fired the remaining 9 rounds at the center of the line. 2 men fell. The others continued advancing. He reloaded. The new strip jammed immediately. The feed mechanism had warped from heat. Pierce pulled the strip free and reseated it. He charged the weapon 3 times before it cycled. The advancing line was at 45 meters. He fired. The weapon fired 4 rounds and jammed again. He cleared it. The advancing men were now firing while moving. Rounds cracked past his head. 1 round struck the tripod and created a sound like a hammer on steel. He got the weapon cycling and fired. 8 rounds. The barrel was glowing orange along a 6-inch section near the chamber. A man at 35 meters fell. Another man stopped and knelt to fire more accurately. Pierce shot him before he could fire. The kneeling man fell sideways. At 14:29, the remaining men in the assault line went to ground. They were at ranges between 30 and 50 meters. They began firing from prone positions. Pierce could not see them clearly through the smoke and rain. He fired at muzzle flashes, short bursts, 2 rounds, 3 rounds, 4 rounds. The weapon was jamming every 6 to 8 rounds now. Each jam required full strip removal and rechambering. A stick grenade arced through the air and landed short. It detonated 12 meters from the crater. Mud and shrapnel whistled overhead. Pierce did not duck. He was watching a man crawling forward at 40 meters. The man was carrying another grenade. Pierce waited until the man raised his arm to throw. He fired. 5 rounds. The man dropped the grenade and rolled away from it. The grenade detonated. Pierce did not see if the man survived. He was reloading again. 3 strips remained. 72 rounds. The barrel was no longer glowing, but it had turned a dark purple color that indicated permanent damage. The weapon's rate of fire had decreased. It was now firing approximately 200 rounds per minute instead of 450. This was due to reduced gas pressure from the damaged barrel. At 14:31, the German fire decreased. Pierce heard whistles again. He looked at the positions where men had gone to ground. They were retreating, moving backward in bounds. Same doctrine as the advance. He fired at them. The range was increasing. 50 meters, 60 meters, 70 meters. He was missing more than hitting. The rear sight was increasingly inaccurate as range increased. A man fell at 65 meters. Another stumbled but kept moving. At 80 meters, they were beyond effective range for Pierce's damaged weapon and bent sights. He stopped firing. He watched them retreat into the tree line. He counted 8 men. He had started the engagement counting 21 men across all groups. 13 were unaccounted for. He assumed they were casualties. He did not leave the crater to verify. Pierce reloaded the Hotchkiss. He had 2 full strips remaining. 48 rounds. The weapon's receiver was too hot to touch. The tripod had sunk 7 inches into the mud from recoil. He pulled it back into position on the crater lip. His hands were shaking. He watched the tree line. No movement. At 14:35, he heard American voices behind him. He did not turn around. He kept watching the tree line. The voices came closer. Someone said his name. He recognized the voice as Kovac. Kovac entered the crater from the southwest side. He had 4 men with him. Kovac looked at Pierce, then at the Hotchkiss, then at the ground in front of the crater. He asked Pierce if he was wounded. Pierce said he was not. Kovac asked if Pierce had been alone during the engagement. Pierce said D'Angelo had left. Kovac nodded. He did not ask why. Kovac sent 2 men forward to check the German casualties. The men returned 11 minutes later. They reported finding 14 bodies. They reported finding 3 wounded men who were disarmed and left in place because no stretchers were available. Kovac asked Pierce how many rounds he had fired. Pierce counted the empty strips. 6 strips fully expended, 1 strip partially expended, 162 rounds total. Kovac examined the Hotchkiss. He pointed at the barrel. He said the weapon should have failed completely. He asked Pierce how he kept it firing. Pierce said he cleared the jams. Kovac asked how many jams. Pierce said he had not counted. Kovac looked at the tree line. He said the Germans would return with mortars or artillery. He said the position was no longer defensible. He ordered Pierce to destroy the Hotchkiss and withdraw to the main line. Pierce asked if he could keep the weapon. Kovac said the weapon was inoperable and not worth carrying. Pierce said it was still firing. Kovac paused. He told Pierce he could carry it if he wanted, but no one would help him. Pierce removed the tripod legs. He tied them together with wire from an ammunition crate. He slung the tripod over his back. He carried the Hotchkiss receiver and barrel assembly in both arms. The total weight was 51 kilograms. The withdrawal to the main line was 60 meters. It took Pierce 4 minutes. He did not stop. At the main line, he placed the weapon on the ground and sat beside it. Kovac assigned him to a reserve position. He was not assigned another weapon. At 16:40, German artillery began hitting the forward area. The shelling continued for 30 minutes. The crater Pierce had occupied received 6 direct hits. At 1900, orders came to withdraw an additional 200 meters. Company K complied. Pierce carried the Hotchkiss. On October 9th, the 77th Division resumed its advance. Company K was held in reserve and did not participate. Pierce was reassigned to a Shosha automatic rifle team because the company had lost both Shoshat gunners on October 7th. The Hotchkiss was taken by a division ordnance officer who said it would be evaluated for salvage. Pierce did not see the weapon again. On October 12th, Sergeant Kovac submitted a report to Battalion Command describing the engagement on October 8th. The report stated that Private Pierce had single-handedly repelled a German assault force estimated at 30 to 40 men. The report recommended Pierce for commendation. Battalion Command forwarded the report to Division. Division requested verification of German casualties. On October 18th, a graves registration team returned to the engagement site. They counted 17 German bodies in the area surrounding the crater. 13 could be directly attributed to machine gun fire based on wound patterns. 4 showed rifle or shrapnel wounds. The team recovered identification discs from 14 bodies. The other 3 bodies were too badly damaged for identification. On November 3rd, Pierce was promoted to corporal. He was assigned to lead a rifle squad. On November 11th, the armistice was signed. Pierce remained in France until April 1919 as part of occupation duties. He returned to the United States in May 1919. He was discharged at Camp Upton on May 27th. His service record included 1 commendation for actions on October 8, 1918. The commendation described him as having shown exceptional courage and resourcefulness in combat. It did not mention the Hotchkiss by name. It did not mention the number of casualties he inflicted. Pierce returned to Lawrence, Massachusetts. He returned to work at the textile mill. His foreman retired in 1921, and Pierce was promoted to shift supervisor. He worked at the mill for 38 years. In 1957, a military historian researching the 77th Division found Kovach's report in division archives. The historian contacted Pierce by letter. Pierce responded with a 2-page letter. The letter confirmed the basic facts of the engagement. It included details about the weapon malfunction and the jams. It stated that he had fired 162 rounds and that the barrel had turned purple from heat. It stated that he did not know exactly how many men he had killed because he could not leave his position to count. It stated that the weapon had jammed approximately 20 to 30 times during the engagement. It stated that he cleared each jam by removing the ammunition strip, cycling the action manually, and reloading. The historian asked if Pierce had kept any physical items from the engagement. Pierce said he had not. The historian asked if Pierce had been afraid during the engagement. Pierce said he had been focused on keeping the weapon operational. The historian asked if Pierce would describe himself as a hero. Pierce said he had done what was required. Harold Pierce died in 1963 at the age of 67. His obituary in the Lawrence Eagle Tribune mentioned his military service in one sentence. It did not mention October 8, 1918. The Hotchkiss M1914 he had used was never located in military records. It was likely scrapped with other obsolete weapons in 1919. No photographs of Pierce during the war are known to exist. Division records confirm 14 verified German casualties at the engagement site. Kovach's estimate of 30 to 40 attackers was not confirmed. The final count from multiple sources places German forces at 36 men. Of those 36, 14 were killed at the crater position. 3 were wounded and captured later. 19 retreated. Pierce's ammunition count of 162 rounds fired over approximately 8 minutes gives an average rate of fire of 20 rounds per minute. This accounts for the frequent jamming and manual clearing procedures he described. The engagement lasted from 1425 to 1433, 8 minutes. Pierce held the position for 6 hours afterward until ordered to withdraw. The German ultimatum had allowed 75 seconds for withdrawal. Pierce gave them 8 minutes of continuous fire instead.